I've demolished your parents' house, just so you know." I was stunned into silence by my husband's sudden declaration. Just the other day, after my father passed away, I had inherited my parents' house and land. Scott, my husband, had always talked about demolishing it to build a duplex, and it seemed he finally took drastic measures. The destruction of the home filled with family memories left me scolding him in tears, but he just sneered with a smirk. "You know, tearing it down myself was tough, but I'm glad I managed to clear the land." My name is Rachel. I'm currently 27 years old, living with my husband Scott, who is 3 years older than me, and we don't have any children yet. Before marriage, I lived with my father and worked hard every day. My mother passed away when I was in high school, so since then, it's just been my father and me supporting each other. Originally, I planned to work right after graduating from high school, and as planned, I got a job at a local company. I'm still working for the same company, where the work environment has always been good, and I find my job fulfilling daily. While Scott can be somewhat unreliable, he was kind and helped with household chores when he had the time, so I had no complaints about our marriage life. However, my only concern was the poor relationship with his parents. At the beginning of our marriage, I had hoped to get along well with my future in-laws. My in-laws didn't seem to think very highly of me, always treating me coldly, and instead of getting closer, we drifted further apart. Gradually, I grew tired of dealing with them, and now I try to avoid making waves as much as possible. Thankfully, we don't live with his parents, and we don't see them very often. If we had lived under the same roof, I might have collapsed from stress by now. It was also comforting that my father lived in the same city. The relationship with my in-laws was a troubling issue, but I hoped that we could continue our married life peacefully without major conflicts. Then, just recently, my father suddenly passed away from acute myocardial infarction, and I was deeply shocked by his sudden death. After the funeral, I often visited my old home alone and cried. However, considering my job and life with Scott, I couldn't keep grieving forever, and I've only just begun to recover recently. With my father's death, the now uninhabited home and land were inherited by me. Since my mother was already deceased and I had no siblings, the inheritance naturally came to me. After finishing the inheritance procedures, Scott and I started discussing more about what to do with my parents' house. My father had once told me, "Rachel, after I'm gone, you can do whatever you want with this house and land." That meant the decision on what to do with the now vacant family home was up to me. This house is a precious place where I lived with my family, and it holds many memories for me. So, I had no intention of selling the land, nor was I thinking of demolishing the house for the time being. Though it would incur property tax, I wanted to occasionally clean the house and immerse myself in family memories, paying respects to the portraits of my parents. That's why I wanted to maintain the status quo for a while. However, Scott had a different opinion. When I acquired the assets, he was as delighted as if they were his own. Maintaining the status quo is a waste. Now that we've got this good land, let's make effective use of it immediately. Scott wanted to utilize the land where my parents' house stood as soon as possible, and our opinions were clearly divided. Indeed, the house is conveniently located a reasonable distance from the station, and the area is well equipped with large supermarkets and other facilities, making it a good location. However, it was built before I was born and was quite old, with many parts in need of repair. When we have children in the future, one option could be to renovate and live in that house. But I just couldn't accept Scott's opinion. It was because he was pushing forward as if the house was his own property. My in-laws had heard about the house and had the same attitude. They had conversations as if they were going to move to that land together in the future, and I felt left out as the heir. Watching the delighted Scott and his parents, I felt a crisis brewing that they might take over the house as they pleased. So I told him repeatedly, "Hey, that house and land are mine, not yours or your parents'. So don't proceed with anything without my agreement." However, he lightly responded to my words, "I get it, Rachel. You worry too much." He never took me seriously. Though I thought he was unreliable but considerate, his attitude changed the moment I inherited my father's estate, barely listening to my words during our discussions. Because of that, I began to feel distrust towards Scott for the first time, and that feeling grew day by day. On a certain holiday that we faced in this situation, Scott said he was going to his parents' house in the morning and left. I was catching up on household chores that I couldn't do on weekdays. But less than an hour later, he returned home with his parents, forcing me to interrupt my chores to greet them. While they might be good parents for him, I still find it hard to deal with his parents because of the issue with my parents' house. "Well, Father, Mother, what brings you here today?" I hadn't heard anything from Scott about their visit, and it was unusual for them to come together to our house without prior notice, so I had a bad feeling. "We need to decide what to do with your parents' house soon. That's why I asked my parents to come." When I asked, he answered with a broad smile, confirming my bad feeling, and I felt like sinking. What to do? I've said many times that I want to maintain the current situation. As soon as I firmly stated this, Scott immediately objected. "That's a waste. I've said it many times too. That's why I'm thinking of demolishing the house and building a new duplex on that land. Then, my parents and we can live in the same house." What? I was utterly stunned by his absurd statement. But I quickly objected. "What are you talking about? There's no way I could agree to that. Didn't I tell you not to make decisions without me?" Despite my desperate opposition, Scott and his parents only looked at me with disdain. Eventually, my father-in-law sighed and spoke up reluctantly. "Leaving such good land unused is a waste. Why don't you start taking him seriously? A wife should obey her husband." I couldn't say that Scott had never seriously listened to me. His parents care about him, so naturally, they take their own son's side. Moreover, my father-in-law is a stubborn man with strong patriarchal beliefs, thinking that a wife naturally should obey her husband. If I were to defy Scott in front of my father-in-law, I would surely be scolded with, "How dare a daughter-in-law speak like that?" And the next to interject was my mother-in-law. "You know, Rachel, we're getting older, and you never know when we might need care. It's obvious that it would be better to live together in a duplex. If we have Scott and you with us, we can live in peace." She said this in a calm tone, but I think she just wanted to live with me to push all the troublesome housework onto me. Right now, next to my father-in-law, she smiled elegantly, playing the role of a virtuous wife. However, when he's not around, her tone towards me becomes more sarcastic, and her attitude changes drastically. When I visited my in-laws' home and found myself alone with her, she started meddling unnecessarily, asking when we would have children or demanding to see her grandchildren, or using her age as an excuse to dump all the housework on me. If I tried to refuse, she would persistently complain. "Shouldn't respecting your elders be natural? What kind of family did you grow up in if you can't even do that?" Living with in-laws who constantly treat me with such disdain was something I couldn't even bear to consider. That house is where I lived with my parents for so long. It's filled with memories. I have no intention of demolishing it. Please just leave it be for now. I was firm in my stance. However, it seemed that Scott and his parents were not about to give up. Honestly, what a stubborn daughter-in-law. It's clear that building a duplex and living together is the best choice for the future. Your parents are gone, so now you should devote yourself to us." Her dismissive remarks about my parents made me want to grimace, but I managed to keep my composure. Ultimately, that day ended with everyone just clashing opinions, and my in-laws left dissatisfied. Since then, Scott and I have been at odds over the house and land. Our current house is too small, and we should build a bigger one for when we have children, right? He was adamant about building a duplex. It seemed he just wanted to live in a large house with his beloved parents under the pretext of having children. I understand the desire to live with one's biological parents, considering the future, but I never agreed to it. I was certain that living with my in-laws would only lead to more disputes. So, setting aside the demolition of the house, I consistently refused the construction of a duplex every time it came up. Then Scott would invariably get upset. As these days continued, our relationship gradually became strained, and time passed without any progress in our discussions. During this time, I visited the family home when I could, cleaning and paying respects to my parents' portraits. However, as work became busier and life more hectic, I couldn't visit the house for about a month. Therefore, I brought my parents' portraits to our current home to pay respects during the busy period. I hadn't told Scott about the portraits, as recently our conversations had often escalated into arguments, so I decided to keep it to myself. But soon, I would realize it was a good thing that I had at least taken the portraits from the family home. It was right after a busy period at work, on a day off. I had thought I could finally relax, but that morning, my in-laws unexpectedly came to our house. It had been a while since we last met, which was when we had discussed my parents' house. This visit was also unannounced, and Scott hadn't informed me that his parents were coming. For some reason, both were in a very good mood, looking at me with smiles as they chatted with Scott. "We have something important to discuss with you today, Rachel." When she said this with a full smile, I sensed that the discussion would not be pleasant. "What is this discussion about?" As I asked, Scott stood in front of me and said, "I've already demolished your parents' house." I was speechless, stunned. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke, but from the triumphant laughter of Scott and his parents, I realized it was true. "What have you done without asking me?" Even as I confronted him in a panic, he just smiled smugly, dismissing me. It turned out that he had demolished the house without my consent, though I was the owner of the house and land. Due to my busy work schedule, I hadn't been able to check on the house for the past month. He had taken advantage of this opportunity. You know, tearing it down myself was tough, but I'm glad I managed to clear the land. Scott feigned a tired expression. He had been reluctant to pay for the demolition and had not hired a demolition company. Instead, he borrowed heavy machinery from his father, who owns a small factory and several pieces of heavy equipment. Without a second thought for his son, my father-in-law had lent the machinery, helping to clear the land. Why would you do something like that without permission? I've always been opposed to demolishing it, haven't I? I couldn't forgive him and his parents' outrageous actions and appealed to them in tears. There were still many of my parents' belongings in the house, including childhood family albums filled with memories. The only thing that was safe was my parents' portraits, which I had brought to our current home. Everything else had been removed along with the rubble, like a nightmare. How could you do something so terrible? I will never forgive you for this. I had reached my breaking point. I told them this while glaring at all three, but none of them showed any signs of relenting. You kept hesitating, so I made a start for us. I can't wait forever for you to change your mind. His attitude was as if he had done the right thing. He continued, laughing loudly. So, I've taken that land for myself. Watching him boast as if he were the owner, my anger turned to dismay. I could feel my love for him cooling rapidly. Neither Scott nor his parents seemed to realize the gravity of their actions, and I sighed deeply. What are you talking about? When did I ever say I gave you that land? Since we haven't done any paperwork, it's still mine. Scott appeared confused by the meaning of my words, and his parents looked perplexed as well. Since we hadn't done the registration process for the land transfer, I had no memory of ever handing over the house or land to Scott. Naturally, demolishing someone else's house without permission is a crime. You might not be aware since you didn't go through a professional, but what you did could be criminal. At my words, Scott's expression hardened. If he had hired a demolition contractor, he might have learned about this. I had no intention of showing any mercy, even to my husband. Moreover, using heavy machinery on someone else's land, even if it was from your father's company, is also a crime. I will definitely be taking legal action. Previously, I had researched real estate laws just in case any trouble arose with the land I inherited from my father. I never thought Scott would actually resort to such drastic measures. When I mentioned the heavy machinery, my father-in-law, who had been all smiles until now, shouted angrily. Wait a minute. You two are married, so your wife's land is practically Scott's too. Then, demolishing that house shouldn't be a crime. I've said it multiple times, but I am the owner of that house, not Scott. Moreover, I wasn't even consulted about the demolition, let alone agreed to it. What he did is a clear criminal act, and I will be calling the police immediately. I cannot stay silent after you destroyed my beloved home. As I responded calmly, my father-in-law was at a loss for words. He seems to have taken this situation too lightly. Even though he lent his company's machinery for the demolition, he hadn't considered that I, his wife, would sue Scott, thinking that clearing the land could somehow justify the act. Reporting Scott. But you are his wife. You couldn't possibly be serious about doing something so terrible, right? As my father-in-law remained silent, my mother-in-law cried out in panic. The terrible thing here is you demolishing someone's house without permission. This isn't something that can be dismissed just because I am his wife or we're married. After responding, I showed Scott the screen of my smartphone that I had searched. The screen explained the legal consequences of his actions. What you did constitutes property destruction. It's a penal offense with possible imprisonment. No fines, jail is certain. Jail, you say? My father-in-law raised his voice in panic, and my mother-in-law let out a short scream. Wait, think this over. Aren't we a couple? Scott clung to my arm with a pale face. However, I firmly shook off his hand and scolded. Stop using our marriage as a shield. It's too late for that now. My family home is gone, along with all its memories, all because of what you did. I'm calling the police right now. And with that, I decided to make the call. At this point, he finally realized the irreversible mistake he had made. Am I really going to be arrested? Me? No way. Trembling, he muttered under his breath, and eventually, he collapsed foaming at the mouth right in front of me. After that, Scott was arrested, and I moved out of the house we lived in with him and rented an apartment near where my parents' house used to be. Although I was ready to divorce immediately, Scott refused to agree, and negotiations through a lawyer dragged on. Therefore, I am now considering a mediated divorce through family court. In the meantime, I hired a lawyer and a private investigator to gather information about Scott. What they discovered was that he had been visiting nightclubs for years and had secretly accrued debt. Scott had his eye on the full inheritance I would receive from my father's estate, planning to pay off all his debts with the substantial amount of money that would come into my hands. When I learned the truth, I was so appalled I couldn't speak. Scott had discussed his debt with his parents, and unbelievably, they had become his guarantors. I can picture my in-laws, out of love for their son, agreeing to help him right away. It seems the repayment of the debt has stalled since Scott was arrested, and now his parents are cleaning up his mess. One day, out of the blue, I received a call from my mother-in-law. "Rachel, please help," she pleaded urgently right off the bat. When I asked what it was about, she bluntly asked me to lend her money. It seems she was being pressured to repay the debt Scott left behind, and their lives had become difficult. She had the audacity to say, "Rachel, you have the inheritance your father left, right? Please share some of that money with us." Impossible. Please handle it yourselves. Feeling no inclination to seriously listen to her, I coldly replied and hung up the phone. However, expecting her to call again soon, I decided to block her number. Since I haven't given out the address of the apartment I now live in, they shouldn't be able to come knocking. I never want to be involved with Scott or his parents again. The call from my mother-in-law made me even more eager to sever ties with Scott, and I decided to file for a mediated divorce. After a while, the mediation was successful, and we were divorced. Later, my in-laws had to sell everything, including my father-in-law's factory, to repay the debts. Now, they've moved to a modest apartment in a remote countryside and are living modestly. Years later, after serving his sentence, Scott was released, but it seems he had trouble finding a job due to his criminal record. He reportedly got arrested again for committing minor crimes like shoplifting, but I felt no sympathy, just disbelief. After divorcing Scott, I began earning a stable income by leasing out the land he had cleared. With the inheritance left by my father, I won't have any trouble living on my own, but I plan to keep working for a long time. Free from Scott and his parents, I can now work more energetically. I'm not thinking about remarriage yet, so I plan to enjoy my independent single life while focusing on my career.